The briefing room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rumble of transport aircraft on the tarmac. Captain Marcus Reaper Holloway, Navy SEAL Team 6, stood at the front of the room, his weathered face scanning the assembled pilots. 37 aviators from various branches sat in uncomfortable metal chairs, their flight suits bearing patches from different squadrons, different wars. The mission parameters glowed on the projection screen behind him. A black operations rescue deep in hostile territory. 72 hours to extract a downed reconnaissance team before enemy forces could exploit captured intelligence. Gentlemen, Holloway's voice carried the weight of 1,000 combat drops. This isn't a training exercise. We need someone who's been shot at and lived to tell about it. Someone who's felt enemy rounds punch through their aircraft and still brought their bird home. His eyes moved methodically across the room. I'm talking about real combat, not training accidents, not near misses over friendly airspace. I mean someone who stared death in the face at 300 knots and didn't blink. The pilots shifted in their seats. A few straightened their shoulders, preparing to volunteer. Others studied their hands, knowing their peacetime service records wouldn't meet the captain's requirements. The tension in the room was palpable. Careers could be made or broken by stepping forward for a mission like this. "Any combat pilots?" Holloway asked, his question hanging in the air like smoke from a flare. From the back corner of the room, a figure quietly stood, not with the dramatic flourish that Hollywood might suggest, but with the measured confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. Lieutenant Colonel Kestrel Ghost, Ravenwood moved toward the exit with purposeful steps, her flight suit bearing no flashy patches, no chest full of ribbons on display. Just simple olive drab fabric and wings that had been earned in places most people couldn't pronounce. The other pilots turned to watch her leave, confusion evident on their faces. Some smirked, assuming she was walking out rather than volunteering. Others noticed the way she moved, economical, precise, like every motion had been calculated for maximum efficiency. Captain Holloway's eyes followed her progress toward the door, his expression unreadable. As Ghost reached for the door handle, Holloway's voice cut through the silence. "Colonel, where are you going?" She paused, her hand on the metal handle, and turned back to face the room. "To prep my aircraft, Captain, unless you need me to fill out paperwork first." Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact, carrying no trace of bravado or false modesty. The smirks faded from the other pilots' faces. Something in her tone, in the way she'd answered without hesitation, suggested they had fundamentally misunderstood the situation. Ghost Ravenwood wasn't running from the mission. She was already 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room, including the SEAL captain who thought he knew what combat looked like. Ghost had learned long ago that action spoke louder than words, and time was always the enemy's greatest ally. While others talked, she moved. While others hesitated, she prepared. It was a lesson written in scars across her back and inscribed in the memories of 17 men who owed their lives to a pilot they'd initially dismissed as just another officer playing soldier. The desert wind howled across Al Assad Air Base as Ghost walked toward the flight line, her boots crunching on sand-covered tarmac. The other pilots were still in the briefing room, probably arguing about who had the most flight hours or the newest aircraft modifications. She'd heard it all before: the posturing, the competition, the endless need to prove themselves to men who measured courage in decibels rather than results. Her aircraft waited in the pre-dawn darkness, a weathered A-10 Thunderbolt II that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and held together with determination. The maintenance crew had nicknamed it Banshee for the distinctive whistle it made during high-speed passes, but Ghost preferred its official designation, tail number 810961, a bird that had seen more combat sorties than most pilots had logged training hours. Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez emerged from beneath the aircraft, wiping hydraulic fluid from his hands. "She's ready, ma'am. Full load of 30mm, mixed high explosive and armor-piercing. Maverick missiles on stations 3 and 9, 500-pound JDAMs on the inboard pylons. He paused, studying her expression. This one's different, isn't it? Ghost performed her pre-flight inspection with methodical precision, running her hands along control surfaces, checking for loose panels or leaking fluids. They're all different, Chief, and they're all the same. She knelt beside the main landing gear, examining the tire pressure and brake lines. Men in trouble, enemy closing in, weather turning bad and not enough time to do it right. But this time they asked for combat experience, Rodriguez pressed. Real experience. She stood, brushing dust from her knees, and looked back toward the operations building where warm light spilled from windows. Inside, the SEAL captain was probably still explaining the mission parameters to pilots who were measuring their chances of survival against their chances of promotion. Chief, do you remember what happened over Kandahar 3 months ago? Rodriguez nodded grimly. The story had spread through the maintenance crews like wildfire. How Ghost had taken ground fire that shredded her left engine and punctured her fuel lines. How she'd stayed on station for 40 minutes while Marines extracted wounded comrades. How she'd landed with fumes in her tanks and 3 feet of control cable hanging loose. That's Tuesday for her, Rodriguez said to himself as Ghost climbed into the cockpit. Ghost settled into the familiar embrace of her ejection seat, her hands automatically finding switches and controls in the darkness. The cockpit smelled of hydraulic fluid, electrical components, and something indefinable that all combat aircraft developed, the scent of controlled violence and calculated risk. As she ran through her startup checklist, her radio crackled to life. "Ghost, this is Reaper." Captain Holloway's voice carried a different tone now, more respectful, less commanding. "I need to know what we're working with here." "Copy, Reaper. I'm working with a 30-year-old airframe, 10,000 pounds of ordnance, and about 6 hours of fuel." Ghost flipped switches with practiced efficiency, bringing her aircraft to life. "What are you working with?" The briefing room had emptied, the other pilots dismissed or perhaps having dismissed themselves from consideration. Through her aircraft's canopy, Ghost could see Holloway standing alone on the operations building steps, a satellite phone pressed to his ear. Even from this distance, his body language spoke of urgency and mounting pressure. The mission was simple in concept, brutally complex in execution. A 4-man reconnaissance team had been compromised while conducting surveillance on a suspected weapons cache near the Syrian border. Their extraction helicopter had been shot down 40 minutes ago. 2 crew members were confirmed dead, but the recon team had made it to a defensive position approximately 12 kilometers from the crash site. Enemy forces were converging from 3 directions, and overhead imagery showed technical vehicles and what appeared to be a mobile surface-to-air missile system moving into the area. Standard operating procedure called for a full strike package, multiple aircraft, electronic warfare support, search and rescue helicopters, and probably a company of Marines for good measure. But intelligence indicated the enemy had captured sensitive equipment from the downed helicopter, equipment that could compromise ongoing operations across the entire theater. They had maybe 4 hours before that intelligence reached unfriendly ears, and assembling a full strike package would take at least 6. Ghost completed her engine start sequence and contacted ground control. "Tower, Ghost requesting immediate departure, mission priority Alpha." "Ghost Tower, cleared for takeoff runway 27. Winds 240 at 15, gusting to 25. Be advised, weather is deteriorating to the northwest." She taxied toward the runway, her aircraft's engine spooling up with a characteristic whine that seemed to harmonize with the wind. In her mirrors, she could see other aircraft being prepared, F-16s, FA-18s, helicopters, but none of their crews had been in that briefing room. None of their pilots had stood up when Holloway asked his question. The tower's next transmission carried an edge of concern. "Ghost, be advised we're showing moderate to severe turbulence reported at your projected altitude and heading. Recommend delay until weather system passes. Ghost lined up on the runway centerline, her aircraft trembling slightly in the crosswind. Through her heads-up display, she could see the storm system approaching from the northwest, a wall of darkness that stretched from the ground to 30,000 feet. Flying into that weather in a single-engine aircraft loaded with ordnance was the kind of decision that ended careers or lives, sometimes both. Tower Ghost, negative on the delay, for men don't have time to wait for better weather. She pushed the throttles forward, and her A-10 began its acceleration down the runway, gathering speed and purpose with each passing second. The wheels lifted off just as the first drops of rain spattered across her canopy. 20 minutes after takeoff, Ghost was learning why other pilots had chosen comfortable desk jobs instead of night combat missions over hostile territory. The weather system had turned out to be worse than forecasted. Severe turbulence that threw her aircraft around like a child's toy, lightning that turned the cockpit into a strobe-lit nightmare, and rain so heavy it seemed solid against her windscreen. Her navigation system showed her current position as a small green triangle crawling across a digital map, marked with red zones indicating enemy activity. The target area lay 60 kilometers ahead, beyond a ridgeline that rose to nearly 8,000 feet. Weather reports from automated stations along her route painted a picture of conditions that were rapidly deteriorating from dangerous to suicidal. Ghost, this is Overwatch. The voice in her headset belonged to someone in an air-conditioned command center hundreds of miles away, someone who was probably looking at weather satellite imagery and wondering why a single A-10 was flying directly into the teeth of a storm that had grounded every other aircraft in the theater. Go ahead, Overwatch. Be advised, we're showing severe weather across your entire route. Lightning activity is extreme, visibility near zero. Recommend you return to base and wait for conditions to improve. Ghost checked her fuel gauge and calculated time to target. The mathematics were unforgiving. She had enough fuel to reach the target area, provide close air support for maybe 30 minutes, and return to base with minimal reserves. Any delay would mean leaving those 4 men to face enemy forces without air cover. Overwatch Ghost, what's the status of ground forces at the target? A pause then. Ghost ground team reports enemy contact. Multiple vehicles approaching their position. They're requesting immediate air support. Through her radio, she could hear snippets of ground communications, urgent voices calling for ammunition, medics, and air support. The professional calm that characterized most military radio traffic had been replaced by the sharp edges of desperation. These weren't training exercises or routine patrols. These were men fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. Overwatch Ghost is continuing to target. ETA 15 minutes. Ghost I cannot recommend. Ghost switched to a different frequency, cutting off the transmission. Command centers were full of people who had never felt enemy rounds crack past their heads, people who made decisions based on risk assessment matrices and career preservation. The men on the ground didn't have the luxury of waiting for optimal conditions. Lightning illuminated the cockpit, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the aircraft's structure. Her flight instruments flickered momentarily, then stabilized. The storm was testing every system, every component, every connection in an aircraft that had been flying combat missions since before she was born. But Banshee had been through worse, and so had Ghost. Her radar warning receiver suddenly came alive with electronic threats, surface-to-air missile sites painting her aircraft with targeting radars. The display showed multiple threats, some mobile, some fixed, all potentially lethal to a slow-moving aircraft flying straight into their engagement envelope. The enemy had been busy while she was fighting the weather. Through breaks in the storm clouds, Ghost caught her first glimpse of the target area, a valley surrounded by rocky hills, dotted with clusters of buildings and connected by dirt roads that showed as lighter lines against the darker terrain. Infrared imagery from intelligence satellites had identified this as a staging area for enemy operations, but seeing it through her own eyes added dimensions that satellite photos could never capture. The valley was alive with movement. Vehicle headlights traced patterns across the landscape like fireflies, all converging toward a single point near the eastern edge of the valley. That convergence point had to be where the reconnaissance team was making their stand. "Ghost, this is Dragon 6. The voice on the radio was different, younger, strained, definitely not coming from an air-conditioned command center. "We are taking effective fire from multiple directions. Request immediate air support, over." "Dragon 6, Ghost. I have you in sight. Describe your position and enemy locations." "Ghost, we are in a cluster of rocks approximately 200 meters southeast of the downed aircraft. Enemy vehicles are approaching from the north and west. We count at least 6 technical vehicles and what appears to be an armored personnel carrier." Ghost banked her aircraft to get a better view of the ground situation. Through her targeting pod, she could see muzzle flashes winking in the darkness. The reconnaissance team's position marked by outgoing fire, enemy positions revealed by the more numerous flashes of incoming rounds. "Dragon 6, I see your position. Keep your heads down, danger close in 30 seconds." She rolled into her attack run, the familiar weight of combat pressing against her chest as the A-10 dove toward the valley floor. Her targeting computer had locked onto the lead enemy vehicle, a technical with a heavy machine gun that was pouring fire toward the Americans' defensive position. The GAU-8 cannon beneath her aircraft came alive with its distinctive sound, not the sharp crack of smaller weapons, but a deep, grinding roar that seemed to tear the air itself. 30mm depleted uranium rounds walked across the valley floor in a line of destruction that connected her aircraft to the enemy vehicle like a deadly rope. The technical disappeared in a ball of flame and scattered metal. "Good hits, good hits." Dragon 6's voice carried the first note of hope she'd heard since establishing contact. "Target destroyed. We have more vehicles moving in from the west." Ghost pulled up from her attack run, her aircraft climbing back into the relative safety of altitude while she searched for the next target. The storm was still raging around her, rain and wind making every maneuver a contest between her skill and the weather's determination to drive her into the ground. But for the first time since takeoff, she was exactly where she belonged, between enemy forces and Americans in trouble, with enough ordnance to make the difference between extraction and elimination. The dance had begun. Dragon 6's next transmission carried urgency that cut through static and storm noise. "Ghost, we have troops in the open, moving toward our position from the northwest. Multiple dismounts, advancing under cover of vehicle fire." Ghost banked hard left, fighting turbulence that tried to flip her aircraft inverted. Through her targeting pod, she could see the infantry advance, approximately 20 men moving in tactical formation, using terrain features and darkness to mask their approach. They were good, professional, and getting closer to the American position with each passing minute. "Dragon 6, can you mark your position with infrared?" "Ghost marking now." A small heat signature appeared on Ghost's thermal display, one of the Americans using an infrared strobe visible only through military optics. The friendly position established a reference point that allowed her to distinguish between the good guys and everyone else trying to kill them. "Dragon 6, I see your mark. Troops in the open, northwest of your position, approximately 400 meters. Confirm you have no friendly forces in that direction." "Confirmed, Ghost. All friendlies are at the marked position." Ghost lined up for her second attack run, but this target required different tactics. Enemy infantry scattered across broken terrain demanded precision rather than the overwhelming firepower she'd used on the technical vehicle. One mistake, one round that fell short or wide, and she'd be dropping ordnance on the men she'd come to save. She selected a 500-pound JDAM from her weapons inventory, then hesitated. The guided bomb would eliminate the infantry threat, but the blast radius might be too large given the proximity to friendly forces. At 400 meters, the Americans would feel the concussion and debris, but they should survive. Should being a word that had ended military careers and haunted pilots' dreams. Dragon 6, danger close ordnance in 60 seconds. Get as low as you can and cover up. Ghost understood, we're taking cover. She programmed the GPS-guided bomb for impact 200 meters beyond the advancing infantry, close enough to catch them in the blast radius, far enough from Dragon 6 to avoid fratricide. The mathematics of controlled violence, calculated in meters and milliseconds. The JDAM released from her aircraft with a mechanical thump that she felt through the airframe. For 8 seconds, she watched the weapon's flight path on her display, a small digital icon tracking toward its programmed coordinates while enemy fire continued to flash across the valley below. The explosion lit the valley like a miniature sun, followed by a concussion wave that shook her aircraft even at altitude. When her night vision recovered, the infrared signatures of advancing infantry had disappeared, replaced by scattered heat sources that no longer moved with tactical purpose. Dragon 6, how do you assess? Ghost, that was danger close enough to rearrange our dental work, but effective. Infantry threat neutralized. We still have vehicles maneuvering on our western flank. Ghost checked her fuel gauge and weapons inventory. Half her ordnance expended, fuel consumption higher than planned due to combat maneuvering and weather conditions. The mathematics were becoming less favorable with each passing minute, but the mission was far from complete. Dragon 6, I show multiple vehicle signatures moving along the ridgeline west of your position. Confirm you need those targets engaged. Affirm, Ghost. Those vehicles are carrying crew-served weapons. If they reach the high ground, they'll have direct fire on our position. The enemy was adapting, using terrain to their advantage while trying to establish positions that would make air support ineffective. It was good tactics employed by someone who understood combined arms warfare, probably a professional military unit rather than irregular forces. That realization changed Ghost's tactical assessment. Professional soldiers would have better equipment, better training, and better air defense systems than the insurgent groups that usually operated in this region. Her aircraft was flying into an increasingly dangerous situation with degraded weather, limited fuel, and an enemy that was demonstrating tactical sophistication. But Dragon 6 was still calling for help, and professional soldiers or not, the enemy was still trying to kill Americans. Ghost rolled into her third attack run of the night, diving through turbulence toward targets that were actively maneuvering to avoid her weapons. This time, the enemy was shooting back with something heavier than small arms, tracer rounds climbing toward her aircraft in lazy red arcs that seemed deceptively slow until they cracked past her canopy. The war was voting on her survival, and the ballots were made of lead. Combat aviation was 10% skill, 20% equipment, and 70% decisions made in seconds under conditions that would paralyze normal people. Ghost had learned this lesson over mountains in Afghanistan, where Taliban fighters had turned supply runs into running gun battles, and every landing zone was potentially an ambush site. She pickled off another JDAM, watching the weapon track toward a cluster of vehicles that had stopped to deploy what looked like a heavy machine gun. The bomb impacted directly on target, turning 3 vehicles and their crews into scattered debris that glowed white-hot on her thermal display. Excellent hit, Ghost. Dragon 6's voice carried genuine enthusiasm. That was their command element. Remaining vehicles are pulling back. But Ghost's radar warning receiver was painting a different picture. New threats were appearing on her display. Search radars associated with surface-to-air missile systems, electromagnetic signatures that suggested someone, was trying to lock onto her aircraft with weapons designed to destroy exactly her type of target. Dragon 6, I'm being painted by Sam's sights. How long do you need for extraction? Ghost, extraction helicopter is inbound. ETA 20 minutes. We need you to keep the bad guys off us until then. 20 minutes. In air-to-air combat, 20 minutes was an eternity. In close air support over hostile territory with degraded weather and active surface-to-air threats, 20 minutes was a lifetime that many pilots didn't survive. Ghost switched to her electronic countermeasures, filling the electromagnetic spectrum with false signals designed to confuse enemy targeting systems. Chaff and flare dispensers armed automatically, ready to deploy decoys that might convince incoming missiles to chase illusions instead of her aircraft. Dragon 6, I'll stay as long as I can. Keep your extraction zone clear of obstacles and mark it when you hear helicopters inbound. She climbed back to altitude, using clouds and storm activity to mask her aircraft's heat signature while maintaining visual contact with the ground situation. Below, she could see enemy vehicles regrouping, forming what looked like a defensive perimeter around the valley's northern entrance, exactly where extraction helicopters would have to approach. The enemy commander was thinking several moves ahead, positioning forces to engage rescue aircraft while maintaining pressure on the isolated Americans. It was professional military thinking applied with lethal precision. Ghost's fuel gauge showed 30 minutes of flying time remaining at combat power settings, enough to provide cover for the extraction, assuming nothing went wrong. In her experience, something always went wrong, usually at the worst possible moment. Her radio crackled with a new transmission on the emergency frequency. Any station, this is Dustoff 73. We are inbound to extract Dragon 6, but we're taking ground fire from multiple locations. Request immediate suppression of enemy air defenses. The extraction helicopter was flying into a trap. Dustoff 73 was a U-60 Black Hawk configured for medical evacuation, painted with red crosses that identified it as a medical aircraft under international law. The laws of warfare required all parties to respect medical aircraft, but the enemy force in the valley had already demonstrated their interpretation of international law by firing on extraction helicopters. Ghost could see the helicopter's navigation lights through the storm, two small points of red and green light approaching the valley from the southeast. The crew was flying low, using terrain masking to avoid detection, but their approach route would take them directly over enemy positions that were now armed with heavy weapons and possibly surface-to-air missiles. Dustoff 73 Ghost, I have eyes on multiple enemy positions along your approach route. Recommend you hold at your current position while I suppress ground threats. Ghost, Dustoff 73. We copy multiple threats, but we have wounded personnel on board from another incident. We need to get these casualties to medical facilities immediately. The helicopter crew was caught in an impossible situation, wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical attention, and a rescue mission that required them to fly through defended airspace. Every minute of delay increased the risk for their current patients while abandoning the men of Dragon 6 to an uncertain fate. Dustoff 73, stand by. I'm going to clear you a path. Ghost dove back toward the valley, her aircraft bucking through turbulence while she searched for targets that threatened the incoming helicopter. Her thermal imaging showed enemy positions scattered across the ridgelines, machine gun teams, and what appeared to be shoulder-fired missile systems positioned to engage low-flying aircraft. She armed her remaining ordnance, 2 Maverick missiles and approximately 800 rounds of 30mm ammunition. Not much firepower for suppressing an entire defensive network, but enough to create opportunities if she used it precisely. The first Maverick locked onto a heat signature that her targeting computer identified as a vehicle-mounted air defense system. The missile streaked away from her aircraft, following its infrared seeker toward a target that was frantically trying to relocate. The explosion illuminated another machine gun position 50 meters away, a target she hadn't detected until muzzle flashes revealed its location. Ghost rolled into a gun run, her cannon spitting depleted uranium toward men who were trying to kill an American medical helicopter. The 30mm rounds impacted in a line of destruction that climbed the ridgeline like deadly stairs, each step marked by explosions and debris. Return fire from the surviving positions was immediate and intense, tracer rounds creating a cone of fire that her aircraft had to penetrate to remain effective. Dustoff 7-3, you have a 10-second window starting now. Enemy fire suppressed but not eliminated. The Black Hawk pilot didn't hesitate. Ghost watched the helicopter's lights disappear below the ridgeline as it dove toward the valley floor, using terrain masking and the suppression she'd provided to reach Dragon 6's position. The maneuver was perfectly executed, aggressive enough to take advantage of the brief window while conservative enough to avoid unnecessary risks. Professional aircrew working together, each understanding their role in a complex tactical situation. But Ghost's radar warning receiver was screaming. Surface-to-air missiles were in the air, climbing toward her altitude with electronic determination. The enemy had waited until she was committed to her attack run, then launched weapons from positions she hadn't detected. Her electronic countermeasures system activated automatically, dispensing chaff and flares while her aircraft's computer attempted to break the missile's guidance locks. Two missiles, approaching from different directions, forcing her to choose between evasion techniques that might work against one, but not both. Combat aviation reduced to mathematics and physics, kinetic energy, radar cross-sections, and the laws of probability applied at supersonic speeds. Ghost pulled her aircraft into a climb, popping flares while turning toward the nearest threat. The first missile lost lock, distracted by decoys and electronic jamming, but the second weapon continued its pursuit. Her heads-up display showed time to impact, 8 seconds and counting. She rolled inverted and dove toward the valley floor, using gravity and terrain masking to break the missile's guidance solution. The weapon impacted harmlessly against a ridgeline 2 kilometers away, its explosion visible as a bright flash against the storm clouds. Ghost Dragon 6, we have all personnel aboard Dustoff 7-3, extraction complete. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by the realization that her fuel state was becoming critical. The combat maneuvering required to evade missiles had consumed fuel at an accelerated rate, and her gauges showed less than 15 minutes of flying time remaining. Dragon 6 Ghost, glad to hear it, safe travels. She turned toward home, climbing through the storm system while enemy forces below continued to search for targets that were no longer there. The mission was complete, 4 Americans extracted safely, enemy forces neutralized or scattered, medical helicopter returned to base with wounded personnel stabilized. But between her current position and the safety of Al-Assad Air Base lay 60 kilometers of hostile territory, severe weather, and fuel gauges that showed red warning lights. The most dangerous part of any combat mission was the trip home. Ghost's navigation system calculated multiple routes back to Al-Assad, each with different risk profiles based on known threat locations, weather conditions, and fuel consumption. The shortest route took her directly over territory controlled by enemy forces, while the safest route required additional flight time she probably didn't have fuel to complete. She selected a compromise course that balanced risk against fuel consumption, threading between known surface-to-air missile sites while avoiding the worst of the storm system. Her aircraft climbed steadily, trading altitude for energy that could be converted back to speed and distance if her engines failed. 20 kilometers from the target area, her left engine began showing anomalous readings. Oil pressure fluctuating, exhaust gas temperature climbing beyond normal parameters, RPM variations that suggested internal damage. The missile near-miss had apparently caused more harm than initially apparent. Debris or blast effects had damaged engine components that were now failing under stress. Single-engine flight in an A-10 was possible but challenging, especially with external ordnance and degraded weather conditions. Her aircraft's performance would be significantly reduced, fuel consumption would increase, and any further combat maneuvering would be extremely risky. Ghost reduced power on the failing engine, balancing performance against the risk of complete engine failure. Her training had covered this scenario dozens of times, but training flights didn't include hostile territory, storm systems, and fuel states that left no margin for error. Overwatch Ghost. I'm showing indications of left engine malfunction, requesting priority handling for emergency approach. Ghost Overwatch. Copy emergency fuel state and engine malfunction. Be advised, weather at Al Asad is below minimums for single-engine approach. Visibility less than half a mile in heavy rain, winds gusting to 40 knots. Perfect. Engine problems, fuel shortage, and whether that would challenge a healthy aircraft with full fuel tanks. The kind of situation that separated competent pilots from dead pilots, often by margins measured in seconds and feet. Overwatch, what are my alternatives? Ghost, we have Balad Air Base approximately 30 kilometers north of your position. Better weather, longer runways, full emergency response capability. Balad was a large coalition base with excellent facilities, but it was also 30 kilometers in the wrong direction, additional flying time that would consume fuel she didn't have. The mathematics were becoming increasingly unforgiving, solutions narrowing to a few options that all carried significant risks. Ghost checked her engine instruments again. The left engine was still producing power, but the trends indicated imminent failure. She had maybe 10 minutes before the situation progressed from emergency to catastrophic. Overwatch, I'm continuing to Al Asad. Have emergency crews standing by. Her radio crackled with a different voice, Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez from her maintenance team. Ghost, Chief here. Banshees brought you home before in worse shape than this. Trust your aircraft and trust your training. Rodriguez was monitoring emergency frequencies from the flight line, probably standing in the rain beside emergency vehicles while watching for her aircraft's lights in the storm. Maintenance crews developed personal relationships with the aircraft they serviced and the pilots who flew them, professional bonds forged through shared risk and mutual dependence. Copy, Chief. See you on the ground. Her left engine failed completely 15 kilometers from Al Asad Air Base. No dramatic explosion, no catastrophic failure, just a gradual loss of power followed by silence as the engine wound down and stopped. Warning lights illuminated her cockpit like a Christmas tree, but her aircraft continued to fly on its remaining engine. Single-engine flight characteristics were exactly as advertised, controllable but demanding, requiring constant attention to airspeed and power settings. Her fuel remaining was now critically low, maybe 5 minutes at current consumption rates. Al Asad approach control cleared her for straighten approach to the longest runway emergency vehicles positioned along the flight path. Through her rain-streaked windscreen, she could see the approach lights cutting through darkness and precipitation, an electronic pathway leading to safety. But her aircraft was flying like a wounded bird, requiring constant control inputs to maintain heading and altitude. The failed engine created asymmetric thrust that wanted to roll the aircraft into an uncontrollable spiral, while her remaining engine struggled to provide enough power for both flight and electrical systems. Ghost Tower. Winds now 340 at 35, gusting to 50. Advise if you need to attempt approach at alternate airfield. 50-knot crosswinds with gusts that could flip her aircraft sideways during landing. Her damaged A-10 would be operating at the very limits of controllability, pilot skill measured against forces of nature that didn't care about mission success or survival. But Chief Rodriguez was right. Banshee had brought her home before, through mountains in Afghanistan where Taliban fighters had shot out her hydraulic systems, over Iraq where surface-to-air missiles had peppered her aircraft with shrapnel. The A-10 was designed to absorb damage and continue flying, engineered for exactly this type of situation. Tower Ghost, continuing approach. She descended through turbulence toward a runway that looked like a thin line of lights in a sea of darkness, her aircraft fighting weather and mechanical problems with equal determination. This was what combat aviation looked like when the cameras weren't rolling. Professional competence applied under conditions that would challenge astronauts. 3 miles from the runway, her fuel flow indicators showed empty tanks. Emergency fuel reserves. Maybe 2 minutes of flight time if she managed power settings perfectly and caught every thermal updraft the storm provided. Her glide ratio would allow her to reach the runway, assuming her remaining engine didn't quit and the crosswinds didn't blow her off the approach path. Tower Ghost, fuel state critical, committed for landing. She could see the runway clearly now, emergency vehicles positioned along both sides with flashing lights that painted the rain in red and blue colors. Foam trucks, ambulances, fire engines, everything needed to respond to an aircraft accident if her landing went wrong. But landing was no longer optional. Her aircraft was committed to this approach whether the runway was clear or occupied, whether the crosswinds were manageable or catastrophic. Physics and fuel consumption had reduced her options to a single choice: land successfully or crash trying. Ghost touched down on Al Assad's main runway with emergency vehicles racing alongside her aircraft, their lights creating an escort formation that guided her through wind and rain toward the relative safety of the taxiway. Her landing rollout was longer than normal due to crosswinds and single-engine operations, but Banshee's wheels remained on pavement throughout the process. She shut down her remaining engine as her aircraft coasted to a stop, silence replacing the familiar sound of turbines and hydraulic systems. Through her rain-streaked canopy, she could see Chief Rodriguez running toward her aircraft, followed by maintenance crews and emergency response personnel. The mission was complete. Dragon 6 was safe. Dustoff 7-3 had delivered wounded personnel to medical facilities, and one very damaged had returned to base with its pilot intact. The kind of successful outcome that would generate a brief report in official channels and be forgotten by everyone except the men whose lives had depended on professional competence applied under impossible conditions. Ghost unbuckled her harness and prepared to exit her aircraft, already mentally reviewing the night's events for the debriefing that would follow. But as she opened her canopy, she realized something had changed during her absence from the base. The flight line was crowded with personnel who normally wouldn't be outside during a storm: pilots, ground crews, support staff, even some of the base administrative personnel. They stood in the rain, watching her aircraft taxi to its parking spot, their presence transforming a routine post-mission recovery into something resembling a reception. Chief Rodriguez reached her aircraft first, grinning despite the rain soaking through his uniform. "Welcome home, Ghost. How's Banshee?" "She needs work, Chief. Left engines completely shot, probably need to replace half the wiring harness, and I think we took some structural damage during those missile evasions." Ghost climbed down from her cockpit, her legs slightly unsteady after hours of high-stress flying. "But she brought me home." "She always does." Rodriguez began his post-flight inspection, running experienced hands over control surfaces and engine components. "We'll have her ready to go in 72 hours. As Ghost walked toward the operations building, she noticed the crowd of personnel parting to create a pathway. Some nodded respectfully, others offered quiet words of congratulations, but most simply watched with the professional appreciation of people who understood what they'd witnessed. At the operations building entrance, Captain Holloway waited under a covered walkway, his SEAL uniform still bearing the dust and grime of a man who'd spent the evening coordinating with higher headquarters. His expression was different now, no longer the skeptical assessment of an unknown pilot, but the respectful acknowledgement of demonstrated competence. "Colonel Ravenwood," he extended his hand. "Dragon 6 sends their thanks, professional work out there." Ghost accepted the handshake, nodding the firm grip and direct eye contact that characterized military professionals acknowledging each other's capabilities. "Just doing my job, Captain. How are your people?" "Banged up but alive. All 4 extracted successfully, intelligence materials secured, enemy forces scattered. Mission complete. Hall."